Vicente Martinez Ybor was born in 1818 in the city of Valencia, Spain. At the age of 14, Ybor would move to Cuba to avoid being drafted into the Spanish military. There, he learned how to make cigars, and by 1856, Ybor would create a cigar company out of Havana by the name of El Príncipe de Gales, or Prince of Wales. Despite Ybor's successes in the cigar industry, he would be forced to flee his adopted home in 1869 after being accused of funding Cuban rebels during the First Cuban War of Independence, known as the 10 Years' War. Ybor would flee Cuba for Florida and would soon resume manufacturing his Príncipe de Gales cigars on the island city of Key West. But by the 1880s, many factors, including labor unrest, fights between his Spanish and Cuban workers, and difficulty of transportation to and from the island would prompt Ybor to start looking for a new home for his cigar empire. Ybor had initially chosen Galveston, Texas, until a friend recommended what was then a small town by the name of Tampa, Florida. Ybor would visit Tampa in 1885, and it quickly became his first choice due to how low land costed in the area and the hot Cuban climate that was great for growing tobacco. And also Henry Plant's newly finished rail line to the city, making transport of cigar products and manufacturing cigars out of the city fairly easy. Known as tabaqueros, see their trade as an art, and master tabaqueros, known as tosadores, often have traded their entire life to master the trade. While Key West had thousands of tabaqueros, Tampa was a small town with no more than 3,000 people, none of whom made cigars. Ybor decided that he would build a company town, but not a town where the company owned all homes and businesses. He envisioned a town where company employees could own their own homes and where entrepreneurs could start private businesses. Ybor knew that he had to attract tabaqueros to his new town, and he hoped that the promise of home ownership would do the trick. He was right. Ybor City's workforce was fluid in early years due to the migratory nature of tabaqueros. Ybor encouraged his workers to stay, and in the new, hastily built wooden cigar factories remained fully staffed and operational all year round. Along with these factories, around 50 small homes were built and sold to cigar workers who paid with portions of small deductions taken out from their salary. Ybor also encouraged other companies to move into the area at the promise of free land, but initially other cigar manufacturers were slow to come to the new town. In April of 1886, Key West would be devastated by a fire, and Ybor's main factory would be destroyed in the disaster. However, this curse would prove to be a blessing for Ybor, as the fire would prompt many tabaqueros to take the first steamship that they could to Tampa. The fire would also encourage other Key West cigar manufacturers to start opening Ybor City branches. Soon, cigar makers were coming from even Cuba and New York, and Ybor City began to grow rapidly. By the end of 1886, over 1 million hand-rolled cigars had been produced in Ybor City. In 1888, Ybor would build the largest cigar factory in the world at the time in Ybor City. But the city was a boom town, mostly populated by men initially. This had prompted Tampa officials to annex the new wild frontier town a year earlier in 1887 and establish a police force despite Ybor's protests. In spite of this new status as a city within a city, Ybor City had brick buildings by the turn of the 20th century and paved roads with street lights and a trolley line connecting it to Tampa proper. By 1900, Ybor City had a population of 16,000, most of whom were immigrants, making it very different from most other southern cities. A majority of Ybor City's population, however, was Cuban, and when the fires of Cuban independence began to rage again in the 1890s, those residing in Ybor did not ignore the plight of their countrymen. Ybor City became a vital source of funds, equipment, and morale for the Cuban revolutionaries. Even the famous apostle of Cuban independence, Jose Marti, would visit Ybor City many times, and his speech given from the steps of Ybor's factory in 1893 would be printed throughout the US and Cuba and would lead directly to Cuba's Third War of Independence. However, Marti would die 2 years later in a skirmish with the Spanish. When the Spanish-American War started in 1898, Tampa would become the main point of embarkment for U.S. forces going to the Caribbean, and over 30,000 soldiers would move through the city. The Cubans in Ybor City welcomed the American forces as liberators, but the war would only last a few months, and at the end of the war, Cuba would be independent, but as an American puppet. Still independent, but I mean, you have to answer to the Americans. And many would return to their homeland to find a war-torn nation, very different from the colony that they had left. And many who had left would come back to Ybor City in order to stay permanently. Would only continue to grow into the 20th century, but Vicente Martinez Ybor did not live to see his dreams fully realized. He did not even live to see the nation that he loved so much finally achieve independence. Vicente Martinez Ybor died in 1896. The Tampa Tribune ran under the headline, "Great Benefactor Gone," and businesses throughout Tampa closed in honor of his funeral. Ybor's Cigar City began as a small venture towards building a different type of company town, but ended up being the largest and most influential immigrant settlement in the southeastern US at the turn of the 20th century. And despite being usurped by Miami's Little Havana neighborhood, Ybor City still has a complex legacy as a cigar town that made Tampa into the city that it is today.